I'd like to, first of all, just start off by thanking 621 for giving me an opportunity to show here and to speak with you all. This is fabulous. I want it to be maybe a little less formal than that sounded, so if you have questions or something occurs to you while I'm talking, please just ask. I welcome that. So please do that. So the way that I see this going is I want to say a few things about sort of where I'm coming from, some of the things that I think about, some particular questions that I have. Then I want to show some kind of examples of other work and then save like what's actually here in the gallery and out around us in Railroad Square for the end. And then, then we'll talk about it. First, a little bit about where I came from and what I think about. So I'm originally from Oklahoma, middle of Oklahoma. This is Perry, that's where I grew up. It's the seat of Noble County, 6,000 people strong. And you can see it actually pretty well in this projection, but you'll notice a sort of a strange thing about the landscape. The landscape, by the way, looks like this. It is just utterly flat. But yeah, if you look at the road map a little bit, you'll see that, in fact, north and south, east and west, every square mile there is a county road, almost without fail, unless there's some inconvenient body of water. If you highlight it, it really does look like this. And if we... Those are all roads. Those are county roads. And if we zoom in a little further, you can see that there's a sort of this subgrid nested inside the bigger grid, and this is the town of Perry, Oklahoma. And if we go in a little further, you'll see that the streets are in fact alphabetical from south to north, and they're numbered from east to west. So the whole thing was this coordinate system. It felt a little bit like I was living, on this. And I think it has something to do with why I make work that looks like this. I think I have been deeply imprinted by the grid. To the extent that sometimes I feel like this guy is looking over my shoulder in the studio. And as you probably know, he's kind of the father of dualism, but also of the grid. So one of the things I think about a lot in my work, in my practice, and in conversation with my students, because I teach art and design classes at UK, is this idea of quantization. When we start to digitize things, there's this process that almost is always part of that. We, as humans, tend to experience the world as a continuous information, as a flowing curve, so as represented here by a sine wave. So this could be light, or it could be sound. And there's all nuances to this, but I'm going to kind of like overstate the point to make it, because our senses are logarithmically calibrated and there's all this other stuff. But in general, this is how we experience the world. But whenever we need to digitize that, whenever we take a digital photo, do a digital recording, take a digital image or a video, whatever, we have to do something to convert this into something that our machines can understand. And the first step in that is to slice that nice, beautiful wave up in time. And this is called sampling often, so there's a sampling rate. You may know that like CD quality sound, you remember CDs, those shiny things? They had a sampling rate of 44.1 K. So they were 44,100 times a second, you got one of these slices. And the point of that is that then once you got it sliced up, you sort of draw a little horizontal line to the next intersection of the wave. And this is called a kind of zero memory quantization. It's the simplest form, but it's what was used for quite a long time. And what this does is it allows you to convert that nice curving sweep into discrete steps that then are easy to represent numerically, easy to store, and easy to manipulate. What I'm interested in is if we zoom in a little further, you'll notice this space that's sort of under the curve but above the stair step. This spot. This is what I'm really interested in. Because this is when you're digitizing something, when you take something from reality and you convert it into a digital form, this is a point of inevitable loss. And this is different from like if you are compressing a file and you can use a lossy compression or a lossless compression. Like there's a whole other, like I said, nuances to all this. But this is the act of acquiring, digitizing the material. There is always this specific loss, and this is unavoidable. Now, you can slice it finer and finer and finer and hopefully get that loss underneath the threshold of human perception, which is what we tend to do. But there is still always philosophically and fundamentally, there is always this loss that occurs. Now, the flip side of that is when things are born digital, when you are creating from scratch things that are digital that you then have to get out into the world, we have the opposite problem. You have to do something to fill that hole. And so different processes do this in different ways. And that's part of what's really fascinating about this whole process is that different ways of filling that hole result in different kinds of experiences, different kinds of results. But whether you're 3D printing from a digital model, that means somehow you've got to get that digital information into a physical form. You've got to stuff those holes with something. So this is what I think about a lot in my practice. This is what I think about in terms of how our relationship with made objects and our relationship with digital tools. A lot of it comes down to this. So again, I want to go pretty quickly through this, show you some previous work. This first piece is an animation. It's a single channel monochromatic animation. It's running there. In this version, it's running on an old Sony CRT studio monitor. And it runs this very simple algorithm where it's either doing just sort of bit flipping, where it randomly goes across and scans the pixels, and if it's black, it makes it white, and if it's white, it makes it black. But then periodically it flips into this different mode where it's like a kind of cellular automata. If you know about Conway's Game of Life, it's a way to do a very simple cellular, a very simple simulation of cellular growth and decay. And so this sort of alternates between those two worlds, and you get sort of these more harder edged patterns, or you get some of these more softer, more cellular patterns. And in its sort of initial incarnation, this is all software, so it would sort of do this until the heat death of the universe and never repeat. Like it would never change. Like it would always change, and it would never repeat itself. Phlogiston is an old concept for this sort of the fire of life. It's sort of what everything from the Greeks to the Victorians thought made things alive or not alive was the presence of this material called phlogiston. Sort of more directly relating to what we were talking about is this piece, which is a digital print that's lit with RGB light. This is what it looks like sort of in white light. So it's a fairly large-sized print. I have 3 digitally controlled RGB spotlights that shine up on it, and the print is done in the secondary colors or primary colors if you're a printer. They're cyan, magenta, and yellow. An interesting thing happens then when the colored light strikes this object. So when the light is red, then the cyan lines become very prominent. And there's a correspondence. And what this thing is a kind of subdivision surface where there's a simple geometric representation of a cage, and then there are 2 further refinements of it that are sort of subdivision. This is a Catmull-Clark subdivision algorithm that came out of like the 70s, I believe. And it's a way to stretch a surface, across a volume where you're trying to maximize the volume and minimize the surface. So it's a really interesting and useful algorithm. And it happens to be, if you ever study small sea creatures like diatoms and things like this, it's how they organically extrude their skeletons. They use the same kind of technique. Of course, they're not doing the computation. That's just how it works. But this is the red condition. The green condition takes us to the next step in, and then the blue condition to the finest subdivision. So it looks kind of like from this to this to this. And by animating the lights, you get this constant shifting from the most to the least complex. I'm not going to say.
Video of it doing that?
I don't have a good video. It's very difficult to. I need these guys. It's very difficult to shoot this stuff. This is. I won't say a whole lot about this. This is a very geeky piece, but it's a little sculpture. You'll notice that I have a thing for tripods, and I can't really explain that. A lot of the work that I do winds up on tripods. This is a little digital sculpture that constantly creates 5-letter words. What's sort of conceptually interesting about it is that there are actually 6 microcontrollers. They're completely independent. They don't talk to each other at all, except that the one on the end simply sends a pulse to the other 5. Every time each of the other 5 gets that pulse, it generates what it thinks is a completely random number and then pulls up a letter based on the number that it generates. But because computers are very bad at generating random numbers, they all wind up generating exactly the same string of random numbers, even though they're not communicating at all, and so they always wind up making a coherent word. So it's this sort of situation where, from their perspective, they have complete free will, but from a slightly higher level, you realize that they're completely locked into a situation and they can't possibly deviate.
I feel like there's some deep philosophical implications there.
I think there might be.
Well, it's the difference between machines and more organic things, I guess.
This is a sort of a brethren piece. This was done, of course, during COVID. And it was kind of a reaction to all of these quack remedies for both COVID-19 and also for the 5G that was causing the COVID-19. There were all these devices that you could buy to protect yourself and keep the bats from being gay and all of that stuff. And so this is a little fantasy piece that sits and monitors the network for disinformation, and then it sort of in a fantasy way distributes counter memes in order to contain the disinformation outbreak. So it has this sort of little sequence that it goes through, and it shows a simulation of the infection periodically, and then locks it down. So just for fun. This is the most recent piece, and this piece is currently on display in Lexington right now. I would love to have brought it, but the things overlapped a little bit. This is a pre-visualization. Since I do a lot of digital stuff, I very often will take it to this level before I ever actually make anything, so that I can sort of get a really good idea of how it's going to look and how it's going to act. So this is just a rendering. This is the cold hard reality of doing prototyping in the real world, is it looks like this for a while. And then these then are the installed pieces. And what I want to say about this is, so the piece that's in front of you is the archipelago. It is not interactive, and I'll explain it in a little bit. This piece is actually completely interactive, and what it does is every little gray box has an antenna sticking up, and that antenna measures distortions in the electrical field that leaks out of the power grid. And those distortions are caused by our bodies because we're very capacitive. And so when we move our bodies through space, we are causing ripples and wakes in the electromagnetic fields that are leaking out into into our spaces. So this only works in a kind of, it wouldn't work if you took it out in the middle of the desert, because there wouldn't be a power grid to interact with. So what it does is it reads these distortions in the field, and all of these little units are playing audio, and the audio are clips of different electromagnetic sounds, and also tones and buzzes and clicks at sort of 60 cycles and multiples of 60 cycles, which is what our power grid runs on. And when it senses that a person has moved past it, it starts to bring that amplitude of that voice up. And so they sort of begin to sing as you move around them. And there's a little display on the front, I think this one should just, illuminated, that actually takes the magnitude of that signal and translates it into the sort of black body radiation curve. So if you were to heat a horseshoe, for instance, it first is red, and then is sort of orange, and then is sort of yellow, and then is sort of white, and then eventually blue, if you can get it that hot. And so these do the same thing, so that you can have a visual reference to the magnitude changing too. And so the name of this, Everything is Full of Gods, that's a quote probably erroneously attributed to Thales, who was a Greek philosopher, natural scientist, who was the first one to talk about static electricity and static charges, which is what this is based on. Another piece I want to mention briefly, this is Automatic Cities, and this was installed in, this is another sound walk, much like the one that's here that we'll talk about in a minute. But this was installed in Sardinia. And what I want to talk about mostly is collaborating and cooperating with machine learning systems and artificial intelligence systems, because in this case, the structure of this, and you can see the whole walk there, each one of those little nodes is a sound bubble. And the whole walk is based on the structure of Italo Calvino's book, Invisible Cities. If you know this book, if you don't know this book, it's amazing. It's a tiny book. I come back and read it, every few years I'll reread it. It's a beautiful book. It's a fictional conversation between Marco Polo and Kubla Khan. And Marco Polo is reporting back about his travel through all these different cities. And it has a very distinct structure. So that's what structures this. And the cities have classifications. So there's cities and desire, cities and death, cities and signs, cities in the sky. And what I did is I fed those prompts to a GPT-2 text generation machine learning software to generate text. And then I took fragments of the text and fed those to a VQ-GAN, which is a generative adversarial network, which is a different kind of machine learning algorithm that makes images out of text. And so the text and the images were then synthesized and made for this sort of sound walk. And I want to talk a little bit. This is the specific algorithm. It's a vector quantized generative adversarial network paired with a contrastive image language pre-training set, which is a mouthful. I'm very bad at math, by the way. I don't think that April believes me, but it's true. I am very, very bad, so I do all of this through just sheer force of will, not because I'm good at it. But this is very interesting to me. One of the fragments that I got from the GPT was life is the parable of fading shadows. So with that text, this was the image without any other prompting. This is the image that the VQ Clip GAN generated from that text prompt. What I discovered pretty early on by doing some more research is that you could push the output towards a style just by mentioning the style. So here you see exactly the same prompt, life is the parable of fading shadows, and then minimalist, charcoal drawing, Renaissance painting, graffiti, etc. And you can see, and if you look at them really closely, you can start to see structural similarities even though stylistically they're very different, the color is very different, but you can see sort of morphological connection points if you really start to look at, if you just sort of squint at them and see how they're structured, you can see some of the sort of same densities of things happening in the different images. So you can see that there's an underlying relationship. What I settled on for this project was the style called chromolithography, which was the Victorian invention that allowed them to print full color onto metal packaging and all posters and very importantly medical illustrations. So and it wound up with this very consistent color palette and a really kind of interesting style. But the other thing that has a huge influence on how these images look is how long you let them cook. So this is an iterative process, and the way it works is the part of the algorithm says, okay, I want something to look like life is the parable of fading shadows. And then the other part makes something. And then the adversarial part says, yeah, that looks like it, or no, it doesn't. And if it does look like it, it keeps that image and then uses it as input to the next stage. If it doesn't, it throws that image away and makes a new one. And so these things evolve over time. And so here you can see that 200 generations, 400 generations, 800 generations, 1,200 generations, and then taking if you take the first image as a guide image and feed it, instead of starting from nothing, you start from that 200 generations, you wind up at this big image here on the right, which was the way that I wound up composing most of these images. It's just a really fascinating way to work. You have to curate really hard because most of what you get back is garbage. So you sort of have to have this relationship with the system. But if you're interested in playing with this, there's a very easy way to do this now. I did most of this with these so-called notebooks, the Colab notebooks from Google, which require a little bit of coding knowledge to just understand how to input things. But there is a service now called Night Cafe that will sort of do all this for you. And it's very inexpensive, and so if you have an interest in this, you can play. These are some of the sort of chapter heading images that came up with. This is cities and signs. Another thing I should mention that if you let it cook long enough, it will try to spell whatever was in the text prompt. So it's a little annoying. You have to stop it at a certain point. This is Cities and the Dead. And this is Cities and Desire. And it's obviously, it got very fleshy. What I'm playing with right now is trying to force it to do things that are sort of non-representational. And so I'm trying to get it, this pair of images came together with the prompt semi-permeable. So I'm trying to think of things that don't necessarily visualize easily and see what kind of things can come back from that. And then just a little kind of a fun thing. I also do a lot of design work, and because I needed to have a promotional poster for my new VR class that debuted last fall, I thought it would just be fun to do. I do a lot of 3D modeling and rendering. Thought it would be fun to do this kind of like vaporwave sort of thing. So these are just some examples. This is what I wound up with as the final image. There's a detail from it. It's actually Napoleon pretending to be Caesar, which I think is great. And I was really delighted that not that one, but another one actually got accepted into the cheap Festival of Street Art in Bologna, Italy. And so they actually pasted a giant, went up with wheat paste, in Bologna, which was kind of awesome.
This one here?
Yeah,
Just on that last slide?
that's one right here. That's actually the wall it's pasted on.
Oh, cool.
It's really cool. So much fun. Okay, so now let me just talk about what's in the gallery, and then we can talk if you have questions more. So this is these guys here on the wall. I'm going to go ahead and turn this on so it's going to make a little bit of noise when it comes up. Oh, thank you, April. These pieces are LED matrices driven with microcontrollers, and the two on the outside share a lot of the code shares a lot of the same DNA. These are running through something that's called a Perlin noise algorithm. So if you can imagine in space like columns that vary in width and thickness in the vertical, and then a plane sort of moving up and down through those columns to take slices of them. That's sort of what these two are doing. And what this one is doing is it is varying, the color palette always stays the same, but it's varying the speed and the scale over time, sort of continuously. It jumps once in a little while. This one, every 2 minutes, generates an entirely new palette and a new scale. And so this one is going to change radically, but only after a certain amount of time. This one is just running through circles of different diameters and colors, and it is also constantly changing. So what's interesting to me about this is that these are fairly low resolution displays. So this guy is only 256 pixels. This one is about 1,500. But that's really, really low res. I mean, the pitch on these is like, it's like this. But when you diffuse it, you sort of get this kind of very continuous, it's sort of like reversing that digital quantization by using something analog like blur to sort of recover those continuous tones, which are not there in the actual image. So that's kind of what I like about this. They're notoriously difficult to photograph. And then just a comment about the technique. Again, I use a lot of digital fabrication, so I draw all this stuff up in CAD, and these guys have been fabricated mostly with the laser cutter. So if you don't have access to a laser cutter, and you can get access to a laser cutter, I highly recommend it. It's the best thing ever. Not as sexy as a 3D printer, far more useful. And then that brings us to this piece. So it hasn't talked yet. What's going on here is that, and I had to say something. So what's going on here is that, I'll do the technical stuff first and then talk about the conceptual. What's going on here is that each one of these nodes has a microcontroller in it that has networking capability over the wireless. So it's a self-generating, self-organizing, self-healing mesh network. And so they talk to each other. If you can see inside one of them and you're seeing the blue flash, each flash represents one of these guys who's joined the herd. And so it starts off and it'll only be a sporadic flash. Eventually it should get up to 12 flashes in a row when they all sort of check in. And then when that happens, one of them will make a decision to play a certain amount of a certain sound clip and also a light pattern. And it will announce that that's what it's doing. And then all the rest of them will either agree and do the same thing, disagree and do something different, or ignore the message and do nothing, perhaps continuing to do what they were doing before. So yeah, they're starting to wake up. This is the actual archipelago. It's a collection of islands off the coast of Stockholm. There's about 30,000 islands. It's one of the most beautiful places on the planet, as far as I'm concerned. And I spent every minute I could in the summertime when I was in Sweden for 3 years working, and every time I could get out to the archipelago, I would go. But it's got this very fraught history. It's the sort of natural barrier to Stockholm from the Baltic Sea. And so since Viking times, it's been a protective element. Vikings several times were trying to raid Stockholm and they couldn't make it. A Russian raiding party back like in 1200 got lost, never got to Stockholm. In frustration, they burned a couple villages and they left. And so there's that sort of history of it being this protected thing. But also, it's where the Stockholmers go in the summer to play. And many, many families, even middle-class families, will own one of these little red cabins, they're called stuga, out in the archipelago. And that's where they'll go. Their families sometimes are generational, and these stay in families for many generations. So during the Cold War, the Russians were blamed for doing submarine incursions into the archipelago. And the Swedes got extremely paranoid about this, to the point that they actually dropped live depth charges out into the water from helicopters trying to blow up these subs. It later was determined that most of these were not actually Russian submarines, but were actually fish. They were just these particular species of herring that have a flatulence problem, and it sounds like submarine propellers on the sonar.
Fishes were farting and they thought that was submarine?
Yes. This was funnier before, this year, the fact that the Russians were pushing supposedly into this archipelago. So anyway, the Swedes overreacted remarkably. They actually hollowed some of these islands out and stuffed them with electronic countermeasures. They mounted guns on some of these islands and camouflaged them so they look like boulders, but if there's ever an attack, they can pop the shells off and these huge naval cannons come up, like a Transformers movie or something. And a lot of this information was not declassified until 2016. So it's sort of raw. So that's the background, the backdrop for all of this. And my thinking is that each of these nodes sort of represents an island in the archipelago. Information flows among them, but there's questions of trust, distrust, information, misinformation, disinformation. And so all of the sounds that you're hearing are either field recordings from the archipelago of water, thank you, of insects, of children playing in the surf. So it's either the sort of naturalistic sounds or they're sounds of electronic warfare or machinery. So satellite transmissions, number stations, sonar pings. And then there's some synthesized sounds sort of as a mediator in between that. And each of these nodes can play as many as 16, can mix as many as 16 channels deep. So the sounds can become extremely chaotic, and it's utterly unpredictable what you'll hear from minute to minute because of this layering effect. And this is a different installation. Inside of each of these little snouts, which are sort of inspired by the twin lens reflex cameras, is an LED array that projects. And if you were to crack one open, they're very simple inside. You've got a sound module, one of these Wi-Fi microcontrollers, and a sort of small full-range speaker. And then, just to finish up, the third sort of third class of piece I have here is there's a sound walk all throughout Railroad Square that is based on an interesting story about August Strindberg, the Swedish playwright. He became very interested in astrophotography in 1840, so before there was much in the way of astrophotography. And he became convinced that he could photograph the night sky simply by sensitizing paper and leaving it out on the ground overnight, and then collecting it in the morning and developing it. And he got these amazing images. They were not of the sky. They were probably just chemical impurities and dust and whatnot, but he got these amazing images. He was extremely excited. He sent them to the French Royal Academy of Science, to a guy named Flammarion, who completely ignored him because he realized that it couldn't possibly be stars, because if they were actually images of stars, they would be streaks and trails, not dots, because of the time-lapse situation. So this is a map of the walk. You start here on Industrial Drive right outside the gallery, and it doesn't really matter which way you go, but you can walk around the perimeter of Railroad Square. There are QR codes outside. I'll show you one in a moment as well. And it's an app called Echoes that allows you to do this. Runs on Apple, runs on Android. Headphones are nice. And you can download the whole walk while you're in Wi-Fi, so you don't have to stream it if you're afraid of data charges. And all of the sound for that, I've been working for the last 2 years teaching myself modular synthesis using Virtual Modular. So this is VCV Rack, and so all of the sound is generated from systems like this that are these sort of very flexible software modules that come together. And that is the code. And again, it's on paper outside. And I am more than happy to, it's a furnace in here, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions you might have.